So welcome to our very first episode and our podcast at Islamic Help. I'm really excited here today because we've got some very, very special guests, heroes that are actually real heroes in real life in our studio today. Welcome, Dr. Victoria Rose.
Thank you.
We've got Dr. Graeme Groom and my co-host, Nazim. Nazim, how are you? Okay?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. I'm really excited about this, to see these guys and to talk to them, hopefully, inshallah.
Inshallah. Well, look, we thought we'd start with our first brand new episode with a bang, and here we are. So, Dr. Victoria Rose, I believe you're a consultant plastic surgeon at St. Thomas Hospital, specialising in complex breast reconstruction. Dr. Graeme Groom, consultant trauma and orthopaedic surgeon from King's College Hospital, London. It's an absolute pleasure to have you both here. So, let's start with you, Dr. Rose. Tell me a bit about yourself.
Where
do you start?
Where do you start? Well, as you said, I'm a plastic surgeon. I don't just work at St Thomas's, actually. I work at King's as well, with Graeme, and that's how I sort of got involved in this whole debacle. So I do breast reconstruction, but I also do lower limb trauma.
Sure.
In fact, we do all sorts of reconstruction in plastic surgery. Most people think that plastic surgery is just nose jobs and but our part of plastic surgery in the NHS is so far from that. We do all the reconstructive work.
Sure. So
for head and neck cancer, for breast cancer, and then our work is with all our sort of mainly road traffic accidents, but we're in Dulwich, so we do get a few shootings. But we get lots of trauma.
So where did this all start for you then, in terms of growing up and going into this medical field? Like, how did it all start? It
started when I was really young. I had a crush on my GP. It sounds really awful. But my mum used to be his receptionist. His name was Mike Jolly. He was an amazing guy. And he just seemed to do, in those days, in the 70s, he did so much more than just our family doctor. And he really looked after my mum when she went through her divorce. And he just looked after the whole family. And I thought, when I was growing up, that was what I wanted to be. I wanted to be like Mike. And as soon as I said I want to be like Mike, my whole family was like, oh, she's going to be a doctor, she's going to be a doctor. And then you just kind of get shepherded into it, and before you know it, you're in medical school. And it sort of happened from there, really.
Oh, fantastic. What about yourself, Dr. Graeme Groom? No crushes from your side?
Sadly not, although my story is much more romantic than Rosie's, because medicine was a second degree for me, and I went into medicine because of the frightful necessity of earning a living, and I because in those days you didn't get a grant or financial support for a second degree, I joined the army. I sold my soul for a mess of pottage, but embarrassed to say that it really suited me, and took me to all sorts of interesting places, doing interesting things. And then when I left the army many years ago, I moved to the NHS in London, and we continued our work with trauma and orthopaedics, but perhaps especially with trauma, and with reconstructing people who were injured, but whose treatment had run into trouble. And we started, or rather we brought with us from the army, a service which was quite new in those days, which we call limb reconstruction. And that paved the way for looking after war wounded. And if I look back, I've been involved in the care of the wounded for 14 wars and civil disasters over the years. So that's really me, but I was interested to hear that poor Rosie lost a parent when she was little because of our charity ideals. When I joined, 60% of our trustees had lost a parent before the age of 10, and that happened to me. So perhaps there's something about losing a parent and supporting the other one and growing up knowing the struggles that the other one is going through, which propels us to this sort of work. But that's just speculation.
Sure. No. And Dr. Rose, obviously, is quite difficult time, losing.
They got divorced, so he didn't die until he was in his. He didn't die until he was in his 70s.
Sure.
But it definitely single parent family. My mum was a really hard worker. She was doing 2 jobs when I was a kid, and you look at that and you get that sort of work ethic. And I think because she was so focused on getting me educated and making sure that I had a job where I wouldn't have to do, although I do, but I wouldn't have to do 2 jobs, or that I would be more financially solvent than she was. You then have that responsibility to sort of do something with what you've been given.
So I think obviously you mentioned ideals, and I think for our audience, and just to give them context, Islamic Help have been working with ideals ever since the conflict began in Gaza. Obviously the conflict escalated in Gaza on October 7th, and obviously we've been working with you guys, ideals. You guys are medical professionals, surgeons that have been into Gaza before and have been going since the conflict began. I believe you guys have both done 2 missions each, am I right? And stuff. So I think what we'd like to start off on is just talking a little bit about maybe the work that you did before this conflict, because I know you've been working in Gaza for many years, you've been many times. Can you tell us a little bit about how that started, how, the first time you went, what was it like, and, what was kind of like behind the decision to kind of go into somewhere like Gaza?
Yes, of course. Could I just say first that Rosie said something was perhaps a bit more important, that when we were growing up, we were both in families where money was a huge issue. So, there was very little about and none to spare, and that might have been a more powerful driver. As far as Ideals is concerned, Ideals began in the smoke and flames of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, and worked there for a number of years with its very charismatic founder, John Beavis. And then when the Balkan Wars came to an end, the charity worked extensively in Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and some of the stories from Ideals' work in Pakistan is acorn to oak tree stuff. Okay. When those projects, several projects came to an end, worked a little bit in Sri Lanka, and then began in the Middle East in 2009 with educational projects in Gaza, 2011 in the West Bank. And then we began, because we saw what was happening there, to begin specific trauma training projects. And by trauma training, I mean trying to encourage or trying to help with the treatment of injured people from the point of injury to the end of rehabilitation. And we began in 2012, 2013, and intensively after the 51-day war in 2014. But none of us imagined what would happen thereafter.
Yeah. What about yourself, Rosie? How was your Ideals journey started?
When I started at King's in 2013, I was going to King's, and being the plastic surgeon at King's was a bit like the poison chalice at St Thomas's. We would send one plastic surgeon would go every now and again, and then they would, as soon as they made their way in plastics, they would give it up and leave. And my turn came in 2013, and it was at the time that the London trauma centres were sort of building up. They'd gone live, King's had gone live, and I was going down there, and I was working with a lovely surgeon called Mark Phillips, and we were bringing all the trauma cases back to St Thomas's to operate on. And it just suddenly became clear that this was just a ridiculous thing to do and that we needed to be at King's. And so I started pushing to get more and more plastic surgeons to come down to King's. And then we started working jointly together. And Graeme and Sarah used to do their Zoom calls with the Gaza team on a Wednesday morning in my office. Okay. At 7 o'clock in the morning.
They used to crash it, yeah?
And I used to come in, because I was training for the London Marathon, and I used to come in my running gear to this room of surgeons in Gaza. And after a while, Graeme kept saying to me, you should come, really, you should come. And then I decided that I knew that you needed a plastic surgeon. I knew that we needed to do what we were doing in London, in Gaza, And the only way that we were going to do that is if plastics got more involved. So I decided to go.
May I just interject at this point? Rosie's behaviour is outrageous in many ways, but she mentioned the London Marathon, and for years, absolute years, I held the departmental record for the London. As soon as she arrived, she demolished my record by 3 whole minutes.
Wow. So there's a bit of a friendly competition there going on, isn't it? And stuff.
Well,
yeah. Is that the same in the medical room, or is it like
no, I've never tried to compete on the medical front.
He just does what he's told.
I think going on to obviously the situation now, everyone knows what the situation is in Gaza at the moment. It's very, very difficult. How did you guys, I guess, feel about going in this time? Was it different to other times? Like, what was the kind of thought process? Because, I mean, for me, looking at it, like, I mean, even when we started this project and everything, working with Tina, working with yourselves, knowing that people were going to go in, my only thing was just like, we're sending people into this war zone where so many people have been killed. The numbers, like, we don't even know what the numbers are at the moment and everything. So, and then obviously that becomes like a worry, but you guys are the ones that actually went.
It was very different this time. I think the first time we went in, I was so desperate to get in and to, see the people that we'd worked with and basically help our friends, because obviously since the war started in October, we had a lot of people that we knew in Gaza, lots of, I had a colleague, a plastic surgeon, Ahmed, who trained with me for 2 years. So I knew him really well, and I knew his family, his children. And then he left to go back to Gaza in the May. So we'd been in WhatsApp contact all of that year. And then suddenly in October, the photos were, of all the terrible injuries that he was treating. And I just felt I need to go and help him. And that was my main objective on the first mission. But the second mission was different, because by the time we went out in the August, the Rafah crossing had closed. So we were testing out the new route from Amman and travelling through the West Bank to get to Gaza through an Israeli controlled crossing. And I think I was a bit more anxious about that, and the rules and the regulations had changed so much. We were restricted on how much equipment we could take. And I think in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, I'm going to get there and I'm not going to have any of the kit that I know they need, and I'm going to be absolutely useless. And that was playing on my mind. And we'd also, at that time, knew how many missions had been cancelled, or how many crossings had been cancelled. There's only 2 crossings a week from Jordan into Gaza now, on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and they seem to be cancelled at least, 2 or 3 a month were being cancelled. So there was that sort of worry that, would we get in? If we did get in, would we be able to do anything? And then I suppose knowing that we were going for a month I think I was a bit more worried about my family, because I knew that there was a lot longer period for things to go wrong, I suppose. And I was worried about how they felt about it. Whereas before we were in for 2 weeks, and it was, like a vacation.
I was actually going to come on to that in terms of your family, really, like going away. How do you kind of like tell them that, look, I'm going? How do they feel about you traveling?
They hate it. My other half, Philip, hates it. We have a period before I go where he just escalates, his hatred of the whole thing, and he gets progressively more and more nasty. And then I go, and then as soon as I get there and I send him back, footage of what I'm doing, he's just, this is the right thing to do. I'm so proud of you. I can't believe you're there. And he's probably my biggest champion. I mean, he puts out all of my videos as well to our family and friends, and he drives a lot of sort of support for Palestine, and he's on loads of groups, and he's very active.
I can imagine that it's to a certain degree, obviously both sides are very difficult, but I'm trying to think in my head, what is more difficult, like being the person that goes in, or being the person that's...
I think being the person that stays behind. I think being the person that stays behind is harder, because once I'm in, I'm very focused on what I'm doing, and I think it never leaves his mind that something bad could happen to me. Whereas for me, that goes as soon as I start working.
So when you're in there, I guess, is it the case that you just focus on the work and that's it, and you're not kind of like, for example, like obviously I think there was some times where you guys were recording videos and obviously we can hear the bombs in the background and stuff. Like, is it for you guys that you're in there, you focus on the work, like nothing else matters, or you have to drown out all of that, which is a lot, and stuff? How do you manage all of that kind of thing?
I think for me it is the workload. You just get you concentrate so much on how much you've got to do and what you've got to do, and the short period that you're in there for. So you're constantly thinking about, okay, I need to do this, and then I've got to see this person, and I've got to do that. And then you have, your Palestinian colleagues who are just incredible support for you. All the nursing team at NASA were amazing. And you take your lead from them. So I remember the first time when we went to the European Gaza hospital and a bomb went off when we were, I think it must have been the first day, standing in the room, and the window shook and I was obviously really scared. And Mohammed, who was looking after us, just said, "Don't worry, it's miles away." And I just immediately went, "Oh, okay." And that's how the trip went. Everybody was like, "Oh, don't worry about that. It's a tank bomb, it's not." And it was, you just, when they worry, you worry, but it's just become
They've already got that natural radar of where everything is.
Yeah.
It's just become normal for them, I think. It's terrible to say.
What about yourself, Graeme, in terms of like what
Well,
you said, family and everything like that?
I think it's clearly much worse for family and for my wife than it is for me. I think it sort of seems strange to say so. It's not being self-effacing. So I'm not a particularly brave person, and so we were anxious before we went. We've been many, many times before October, but after October it's been totally different. And I think I would say that I've been anxious until we get there, and then for reasons that are quite inexplicable, that anxiety just fades away. And then we are, as Rosie says, wholly engaged in what's going on. In the morning, we've spoken before about the dawn chorus of bombs and tank shells and automatic fire, and then it starts again as a lullaby in the evening. But for some reason, that's not particularly frightening because it's not aimed at us. I think, excuse me, I think what is much more of a problem, and this is the way I feel about it, about going to Gaza anyway, is that we're so aware of the people at whom the bombs are aimed, and that makes me angry. And then I think I feel very privileged, as does Rosie, to be able to go there, to support good people in times of trouble, to be with our friends and colleagues at such a terrible time. And then the third dominant emotion, from which Rosie doesn't suffer, is I feel inadequate to the task, to the number of people, for what we have to do with the available equipment. And so that's in a word how I feel when we go to Gaza. I feel angry, I feel privileged, but I feel inadequate.
I remember you mentioning actually, obviously with the bombing and everything like that, you had a bit of a secret weapon with it in terms of being able to deal with it yourself.
I've got a secret weapon in Rosie.
You know what I mean?
You're just taking your hearing aids out.
Yeah, you just take your hearing aids out and stuff and everything. So.
Well, that's mostly the conversation. So we're very packed together, and it's quite a noisy place, and that's great help. Sadly, I can still hear the bombs and bullets without my hearing aids.
I mean, Dr. Rose, with yourself being in Gaza, you've probably seen so many different types of injuries. What are the most common injuries that you've come across when you've been on mission?
I think the most common injuries are loss of limb. So sort of a bomb or a blast has partially destroyed a foot, a leg, a hand or an arm, and you've got to complete the amputation because there's no way of salvaging That's probably the bulk of what we do jointly together.
And in terms of resources, obviously they're very limited as well. How do you handle that situation, knowing you're in that hospital, you've got very limited resources, but the situation there is so difficult?
I think I had a secret weapon when I went in the march, because Ahmed we'd had a long conversation, and I knew I was going to the hospital that he'd been working in, and we had a long conversation about what I needed to bring with me. So when I went to the European Gaza in March, I had sort of 5 suitcases full of plastic surgery dressings, and that was a godsend. When we went to Nasser in August, we couldn't take anything with us because of the regulations, and it was very simple dressings. I mean, we were putting vinegar on wounds, and it was, we ran out of hand wash at one point, and there was a shortage of the skin prep that we were using. So I mean, you can't, it's frustrating, but you can't get annoyed, because it's not their, it's not the people in Gaza's fault. It's not that they haven't ordered it or they've forgotten to order this. It's they can't get hold of it. So you have that sort of, scrap heap challenge moment, really, where you've just got to do what you can with what you've got.
So I think,
and working in the NHS does prepare you for that a bit.
I think the serious point is, but that since Rafah closed, and all access was from Amman Allenby Bridge and the Kerem Shalom crossing, WHO report that humanitarian assistance of all sorts, including people, has been reduced by more than half. So that when Rafah was open, and that was our access point, we were able to take probably what we needed. What we need in orthopedics is perhaps more than what they need in plastics, because there's so much equipment. But we didn't have enough travelling through Rafah, and that was reduced by more than 50%. And that's a huge problem. Rosie, as I say, is quite difficult to manage. And in spite of strict instructions that she was not to take anything, she took 3 little microsurgical sets, and she performed absolute wonders with them. But if she hadn't broken the rules, if she hadn't taken those in, she would have been hugely restricted. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it was really difficult, because when we came back in March, we'd obviously raised quite a bit of money through the Ideals website, and so we had spoken to the rest of the team, and we decided that we would buy equipment with it, because we knew that wherever we went there would be a shortage of equipment. So I had a budget, and I had bought some brand new sets, some microsurgical sets and some basic plastic surgery sets, and then literally Rafah closed, and they are still sitting in a box in my front room. And that was the hardest thing, was leaving in August with kit that I knew they needed and not being able to take it in.
It must be a massive frustration, obviously.
And now not knowing when we're going to get it in, and and it doesn't matter where we go next, whether we go back to Nasser or EGH or even Al-Aqsa, we know those hospitals need this equipment.
I know that obviously the first deployment that you went on, it wasn't easier, but it went a bit more smoother, and we know that there was some frustration on the second one, this one in August, that where you went to Al Nasser. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges of that, and obviously the frustrations that you guys had with all of that, and how you kind of dealt with it? I know it's a bit of an open-ended question in that sense, but it'd be good to, I guess, to understand, the differences, these nuances.
I think, if I may just follow on from what Rosie said just now, we're aware of how productive our partnership of Ideals and Islamic Help has been, and how much money there is potentially available for equipment, and that equipment could make such a difference. But at the moment, we can't buy it, and we can't get it because we can't transport it. If we talk about the very first mission after after October, we weren't able to get access until Christmas and New Year.
Yes.
And we were really feeling our way then. It was so different from when we'd been before. The accommodation was terribly different. You know, we were lucky that we had beds, because most folk would just have mattresses or air beds on the floor. We'd be very close together. There was no organised catering. Water was short, so sometimes there was water in the tap and sometimes there wasn't. And at that time, we were living in the European Gaza hospital, so that what we had was what the patients had, and at that time there were about 900 patients, but 22,000 displaced people in the hospital on the grounds, in every nook and cranny. So that we didn't really know how to live. We didn't know how to feed ourselves. We didn't know about how useful it would be to employ somebody to help us so that we could get on with work. That developed really in the third visit, when we employed a lovely young man, and we kept going with him on the fourth visit. And we had a number, as Rosie has said, a number of council trips. And this last visit, we were in a different hospital. We were with a different partner there, and it was totally different. So all the survival sides, accommodation, board, transport, was looked after, and we focused on the work, which we were less able to do in the first visits.
What about yourself, Rosie, in terms of comparing the two deployments that you had?
I think that the second visit was definitely much better in terms of everything else was taken care of. So you just worked. So accommodation, food, water, sanitation, all of that was completely sorted. So, you know, on the first time in March, you didn't know whether there would be any water when you woke up in the morning, and then if there wasn't anywhere you were, you may have to go to one of the other buildings to see if there was water there. So all of that went in the August trip, but the working hours were curtailed because of the security issue, and the NGO that we were with was very security conscious, and so they limited what time we started and what time we finished. And at the time that was hugely frustrating, because I often feel that, you know, my security when I go to Gaza is discussed with me and my family before I get on the plane, and then it's in the can and it's done. And we don't really need to think about it, because that's already been thought about, you know, more than it needs to be. So then to be told that we couldn't work longer because of security issues, you felt almost, you know, it was annoying. But then as we did manage to sort of move things slightly. And as the weeks went on, it would have been very difficult to work the sort of, you know, 16-hour days that we were doing at the European hospital. We were there for just over 2.5 weeks. So that already brought us to our knees at the end of that period. And if I did that sort of pattern for a month, I think I would have become completely drained by about week 3 and on my knees, and not been able to cope with anything else. So there were, you know, some benefits from it, but it was equally frustrating. The main thing that I think I've realised, though, is that we were in very privileged positions on both the trips that we went. So when we went in March, because we'd had one of our plastic surgeons, Ahmed, had been working at the European Gaza Hospital. When I got there, we had almost been given his theatre, and so we had access to a theatre in that hospital practically every day for as long as we wanted. So we just operated non-stop. And again, this time when we were at NASA, 2 theatres had been isolated for us to use, and we weren't competing with any other surgeons, be that local or other NGOs. And when I talk to other volunteers who have been, and they say, you know, I average sort of, you know, 1 or 2 cases a day, I think, well, we were very lucky in the setup that we've had, because we, you know, this time we did nearly 200 cases between us, and it's an incredible amount, and that was totally facilitated by our partner this time.
I guess it's with it, it's kind of like the balance of the operation, the security, all of these kind of things.
You have to take the rough with the smooth, don't you? And sometimes you just have to swallow it and do what you're told.
And I'm guessing you were a bit rebellious with all of that.
I felt like I wanted to do so much more. That was the
May I just say how pleased I am that comment from Rosie has been recorded.
Okay. Is it difficult to get her to admit it?
Sometimes you just have to swallow it and do what you're told.
Okay.
Can I have that as an isolated clip?
Yeah. We'll clip that up for you and send it to you anytime you need to use it for all the...
Thank you. I think that's absolutely true. It may seem surprising to folk who don't know the pattern in which surgeons work, but it's very unusual to be operating every day, because obviously we have to see patients before and afterwards. We have to make assessments, and caring for a patient, a wounded patient, is much more than just doing the operation. So this was absolutely unusual, I think, for both of us, that we spent time, we were operating on 4 or 5 cases each a day for the whole time we were there, for 26 days continuously.
Every single day.
That's quite an unusual pattern of working.
How do you guys cope with that? Because that's, you know, emotionally, from a stressful perspective, and even on a personal level, that's quite powerful, you know, psychologically, to be doing that every single day. How do you cope with that?
I think at the beginning it was quite stressful, because you sort of worried about, you know, how much there was to do. But actually it did enable you to take things more slowly. And I think that a lot of the patients I treated this time, because I was there for the month, their problems were sorted by the time that I left, and I felt much more comfortable leaving. Whereas in March, I felt a bit more pressured to do a definitive or the final operation probably too early, because we found that we were having a lot of problems with wound healing and wound infection. And actually quite a few of the patients needed the wounds cleaning, you know, a couple of times before we closed them. And if you close them straight away, they just got infected and fell apart. And I saw that in March, and because of this August trip and having that much more time, you were able to plan things. So I could do, you know, plan the debridement, plan certain dressing changes, knowing that I would do the final closure on this day, and then I would be able to look at the wound the next week and then discharge them at that point. So it was a bit more satisfying from that point of view, I think.
Absolutely. I think there's a distinction, which again may not be immediately apparent in the care of injured patients, that there are some who need a number of staged operations, and others, if you have exactly the right circumstances, you can do a definitive operation and then do one operation, and that's the end. It's not the end of their rehabilitation, but they can be discharged, and they can no longer, if you like, be a burden on the healthcare system, apart from rehabilitation. Now, in December, January, when we were there, we had a colleague, which none of us enjoyed, but this wonderful person had been the director of a neurosurgical project for another charity. And she was injured, and a number of her family were killed in a house in a safe zone by a tank shell. Now, her injury was largely a crush injury, and we were able to gather together the right equipment and do a definitive operation so that she could be discharged in 2 or 3 days, and that's all she needed. Now, if you were equipped to do that, in the longer term, that is a huge bonus for the healthcare system, rather than a temporising operation, and then another one and another one and another one. One of the patients we found there, who was only 11 years old, he had had 10 operations by the time we met him, and only 2 of them had any chance of progressing his treatment towards healing. So that's that's an important distinction, and it's an advantage of being there for a longer period.
Yeah, I think that the thing that we see in that type of environment is that lots of the wounds are blasts and bombs, and so the wounds are covered in soot and grit and bits of rubble, and so when you get them, if you can get the wound and clean it in the first go and close it, then your success rate is higher. But what was happening was, because there were so many patients coming, the wounds were having a sort of an initial clean and being dressed, and the patients sent back to the ward, and then you would never get them back to do that definitive closure, because somebody else would come in with a more significant wound, so you would sort that one, and then the next day there would be more and you would sort that one, and finally you'd get to the patient you started on 3 or 4 days later, by which time the wound's infected now, and you can't do that definitive closure. So the operation is now another clean, another wash, another dressing, and that went on for a while. Whereas we seem to be able to break that cycle this time because of the regularity that we were there. So, and also there were a few instances where we picked up patients, the day after, and we managed to. So the little girl that had the open fracture, we managed to get her the day after she was hit in the leg, and we did her definitive, clean close procedure the next day. And that's how we would work in the UK. But the volume stops you from doing that in Gaza.
It must be really heartbreaking seeing, children. Dr. Graeme, you mentioned about an 11-year-old. How do you? Are there any stories or any children that you remember that you really felt connected with?
Yeah, there's loads actually, loads and loads of children. Obviously, I think the one of the Ahmed, who you featured in your video or in your Instagram, who's the little boy who lost his nose and had the blowout of his lip. He was very significant because he just did so well after the surgery, and because he was in the hospital for sort of 3 weeks before we managed to, the procedure is planned so that we would do the reconstruction, and then we would revise the final part of the reconstruction 3 weeks later. So I had him every day, and I would see him every day, and his family every day. And he was just such a great child. He was, very positive. He was very grateful for what I did. And I did have a real connection with him. And it wasn't until we left, when our driver was sort of sorting out the last morning logistics for us, and he came up to me and he said, he announced that he knew Ahmed's father, and I had no idea. And he said, Ahmed's father was so depressed before we came to NASA, because Ahmed had sustained this injury about 6 weeks before I got there, and nobody had been able to explain that they would be able to sort it out. And I think Ahmed's father had got to a point where he thought his son would always have this disability of not being able to eat properly because his lip had been destroyed, and obviously physical appearance had changed so much. And our driver said, he was so despondent, and then you came and you sorted it out, and I just want to say thank you. And I don't think because you don't realise how long these people have been, in the situation that they've been in. So that was he's one that I will always remember.
I can only imagine what that's like in terms of obviously all of the stuff that you've been through, all of the difficulties in terms of getting there, everything like that. I'm guessing when you hear something like that, that must be, it doesn't matter. Everything else doesn't matter. This is what it's about.
It is. And then at the same time you think, well, why haven't they had a plastic surgeon before I got there? And then we were talking to the NGO, and there hadn't been a plastic surgeon at the hospital since May, I think. And so everybody had, sort of
May I just
untreated.
I'm just looking at the time because I know, Dr. Rose, you've got
really sorry.
another charity due to attend. So we will be back with you, Dr. Graeme, in just a second.
Well, I'm quite happy to talk about her once she's gone.
Okay. That's even better.
But just before you go, Dr. Rose, one final question for you, which we'd like to do in all of our episodes, is ask you one charity moment that has kind of stuck with you, something that you will remember forever that you'd like to share with our viewers today?
Oh my goodness.
Sorry to put you on the spot before you leave.
He's not sorry. He's not sorry. He does it to everybody.
Oh, there's loads. There's loads of things that have been. I think I'm going to say probably one of my favourite charity moments was at the Islamic Help dinner that we went to in Luton, and I had 3 girls come up to me at the end. We'd been on stage and we'd given a talk, and 3 girls came up to me at the end, and one of them was a medical student, and she was saying to me, when I qualify, I'm going to come find you and get in touch and basically come and help. And it's just to, I think, to inspire other people to do what we do. is has been one of the things that I wasn't expecting to get out of going to Gaza.
Well, look, I'm sure you've inspired many of our viewers and many people around the world. It's honestly a truly proud honour for us, working with you and everything you've done. May God continue keeping you safe.
Thank you
for
so
all your
much
journeys.
for
And honestly, it's a
enabling
pleasure
it.
being here. So we're just going to pause very quickly so we can see Dr. Rose going to her charity do, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you.
Thanks very much for enabling it all. Honestly, just to be able to get out there, it's been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'd like to thank Dr. Rose for coming, and we've still got Dr. Groom here with us with his wonderful coffee mug. Hello, handsome. So, Dr. Groom, we're going to continue with yourself. As Dr. Rose left, she was talking about Ahmed, and you wanted to touch on that story.
Yes, thank you. It's always best to talk about someone once they've left the room. And it's a pleasure to talk about Rosie. Most of the time we were in Gaza, we were working together with limb injuries, and it would depend whether it was orthopedic heavy, so to speak, or plastics heavy. But in the context of the facial injuries, she did almost all of that by herself and was absolutely superb. I think there are 2 things about this poor little boy. First of all, he had a terrible facial injury, and you could see why, as it was untreated for such a long time, why his parents were so anxious about him and his future. What she did was an operation to bring a flap from his forehead down over his nose to recreate the nose, as well as repairing this horrible wound to his cheek. Now, that isn't a modern operation. That's an operation that's many hundreds of years old and originated in India at a place called Nasipur, or perhaps Naskatipur. And it was called that because, and the operation developed there because a prevalent punishment for wrongdoers was to have your nose cut off. So she used, for this little boy, she used an ancient operation that was formerly used as a punishment. And the first thing that struck us was, what had this young man done to deserve that punishment? But the second delightful thing was that we saw him 4 hours after his second operation. The second operation, and they're 3 weeks apart, the flap goes down, and then 3 weeks later the flap is divided, his forehead is restored, and his nose is reconstructed, and his cheek was already reconstructed. 4 hours after that, he was sitting up in bed, eating crisps and smiling and laughing and speaking to us, and that seemed to be just a delightful moment.
And what was his thoughts of his parents when they saw him from
I
before
think
the
his
surgery to
parents
after?
were very, very happy.
Yeah.
Not only his parents, but all the family group that surrounded him. They were very happy, and it was a wonderful thing to witness.
We asked Rosie about like her favourite child patient, and something that's kind of stuck with her. What about yourself, Graeme, in terms of were there any patients, were there any procedures that you did that really stick out that you want to kind of share with the audience?
Well, I think my feeling about what's been best about Ideals and our involvement in Gaza is rather more long term.
Yeah.
There are many individuals for whom I remember, and they're terribly rewarding. And one of the issues about going back frequently is that we're often we meet people who've been patients in the past and who come up to us and say hello and show us what's happened to them and are very friendly and grateful, and that's terribly moving. But I think the best thing for me is what's happened over time, is that when we started this work many years ago, we were thought, generally speaking, and folks said this to us quite openly, you don't come for long enough, you don't see enough patients, you don't do enough operation, your project is of limited value. Now, we can't go for longer because we use volunteers from the NHS. They're all doing it in their annual leave. And so the model was frequent short visits, but very intensive. And over time, the thing that has pleased me most is that from being rejected as an unsatisfactory model, we became known as one of the most effective models of intervention that was available in Gaza. That's by a distance the most rewarding thing for me.
And it's that, I guess, that having that plan for long-term work and building the capacity of the hospitals in Gaza that gives you that satisfaction. Can you talk a little bit about that and what Ideals do in regards to that as well?
Well, the point of difference for Ideals is, I think, the long-term support. Ideals stands for International Disaster and Emergency Aid with LS, long-term support. And I think that now we've been there for 14 years, that's more or less demonstrated the meaning of long-term support. And the difference that makes is that we know people. We've had 7 Palestinians come to London for fellowship training. We know the folk who are in authority. We know colleagues in all the major hospitals. And so it's very easy for us to arrive out of the blue and in times of terrible trouble and fit in. Many of the other NGOs who are there for shorter periods or are new find it much more difficult. And
given obviously the recent situation and everything like that, what is your, I guess now, like, has your mission changed in any way, shape or form? Like, how did, like, obviously before you had regular missions that were going, you were doing long-term kind of training with the local people, local surgeons, giving capacity training. That was how it became more sustainable. But how would you say that kind of project is shifted in design?
Well, since this appalling war began, it's changed completely. Really, since 2015, with varying degrees of emphasis, we've had 4 objectives: treatment, training, building capacity, and delivering equipment. Well, where we are now is that the people we've involved in training are scattered. The focus has been all on treatment. We're no longer now concerned with capacity building. And the circumstances have made bringing new equipment in so difficult. It's so that since the war began, our focus has been on treatment and supporting our Palestinian colleagues in that.
I think for all of us working in the NGO sector, especially when it comes to areas like Gaza, areas where there's a lot of conflict, when you have some periods where there's not as much conflict or not as much escalation of conflict or anything like that, that is where you build up. And I think one of the things as well is that we reflect on as Islamic Help. We work in Gaza. We've been working for many, many years there. And a lot of the times it is the case of you're trying to build something back up, and then obviously an escalation happens, and it does feel like you're kind of always going back to the beginning again and trying to build it up again and everything like that. And I guess it's the same for the medical work. And how do you kind of handle that frustration? Because I know from our side we have to handle that frustration and having to kind of do that. But how do you guys like?
Well, I absolutely agree. I think it's just it's very, very affecting to see so many hospitals destroyed, see teams scattered. But what is remarkable in the two hospitals in the south that we know best, in the European Gaza hospital and in the Nasser hospital, how much has survived, how many of the teams we know are still working. And I think in terms of our response, collectively, we just draw a deep breath and start again. We very much hope to be involved in the reconstructive efforts.
Yeah.
We have a group of amazing volunteers, and we hope that we'll be able to deploy them.
Yeah.
We can't at the moment because of the so few of them. You can't have a job a full-time job in the NHS and other commitments and go to the Middle East for 4 weeks at a time.
Yeah.
But we hope we'll be able to get back to what we know best and to contribute to the reconstruction.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of, so obviously over the years we fundraised many times for Gaza, many escalations, all of the different areas. And there was one point where we were fundraising for reconstructing homes. And so we had like an event similar to the one that we had, like a fundraising event. And one of our donors, they pledged to build a home. I think it was like 2,500, 3,000 to build somebody's home and everything like that. And they asked us the question. They were like, it kind of dawned on them, what if that home gets blown up again? Like, I'm going to donate and everything like that. And they kind of realized, obviously, it's a conflict zone and everything like that. And they even just came to that self-reflection of, okay, you know, if they destroy it again, we'll rebuild another home. And I guess that's the kind of attitude that we just kind of have to have with it, isn't it? And no matter what happens,
You've almost got to reset, focus, and then continue, like you mentioned, and keep going.
Yes, I think that's one thing for us who are external, who have choice. I think that this war is so appalling that the attitudes within Gaza are changing. And I wish that Rosie was still here to speak for herself. But 4 people said to her, and by proxy to me, they said that they no longer wished to be thought of as courageous and resilient. They wanted the war to end or for them to be dead. Because the way it was just so intolerable. Going to sleep every night, not knowing whether they would wake in the morning. And I think that coming up just shy of a year of bombs, the quantity of explosive that's been dropped on Gaza is incomprehensible. 4 or 5 weeks ago, it was estimated to be 80,000 tons of high explosive. Now, the atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one was, I understand, a 15 kiloton weapon, and one was a average 20 kiloton weapons. Now, if these figures are correct, that indicates that the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs has been dropped on this area, 42 kilometres north to south, and an average of about 8 kilometres east to west. It's absolutely incomprehensible. And driving through these places and watching people trying to live in an apocalyptic landscape of devastation is deeply affecting.
Yeah. Talk us through that. I guess obviously you've driven through those areas and stuff, seeing the destruction, how the people are living. Can you paint a picture of it in terms of how it was?
Well, I think that's as I say, it's very hard to find an undamaged building in Gaza. I think as we went through Kerem Shalom, the first bit, which takes us past the old airfield destroyed very early on, in previous wars, probably nearly 20 years ago, I should think, that is an absolute moonscape. There seems to be nothing alive. And then we came to an area of destroyed buildings, and there would be small groups of men. And then we would reach the main road that goes north to south. You forget how small Gaza is, but the main road is the Saladin highway. And when you reach that, every building is damaged, but they're not completely razed to the ground. And there will be people living in the ruins, living in tents round about them. And then when we got to the so-called secure zones at El Mawasi, which is where our accommodation was, then you just come to this ocean of tents. They're called tents, but they're not. They're the flimsiest of shelters. And in summer, they don't keep the heat out. And in winter, during the rainy season, they will be absolutely appalling. Each one, what do we do for sanitation? I'm told that each little shelter has a deep hole, 3 or 4 meters deep, and that's what they use as a lavatory. Water is entirely another question. If you have money, you can pay for it to be delivered, but most people have to go and collect it in buckets from a distribution point. And of course, we saw all this. And the thing that was impressed me was the discipline and, as I say, resilience of the population who just got on with it. I think 80% of our colleagues, professional people, just like us, they would do a normal day's work at the hospital, and then they would go home to a tent. And yet every morning they'd turn up spick and span. They're very clean. That's a silly thing to say, but they come across as very clean people. Washing is very important to them. Being unable to wash is a real deprivation in itself. And this is somehow how they survive. And almost every one of them, in losing their homes, have lost family members. Again and again and again, we heard exactly the same story. And it...
I can't imagine what that's like for those people and stuff. And I think, obviously, I've worked in this field. I've gone to areas, many countries across the Middle East, Asia and Africa and stuff. And for me personally, my faith is very important in terms of how we kind of deal with it. Obviously, when you're seeing something so difficult, and obviously we are called Islamic Help. We're a humanitarian organization that is inspired by our religion. We don't hide from that, in any way, shape or form. And I know for yourself, Graeme, that your faith is very important to you. And I just wanted to touch on that and your feelings on that and how that inspires you, how that helps you maybe cope with something. Because I think sometimes when people see a situation like that, they kind of just think, how could God let this happen, and all of these kind of things. So I just wanted to kind of ask you about that and how you felt about those.
Well, my faith is important to me. I'm Christian, not a very good Christian, but nonetheless, I am a Christian. And I think I was particularly pleased to go to so many of the Islamic Help gatherings, because in them, listening to the prayers, listening to the declaration of faith, it did occur to me that there is so much more that unites us than divides us. The love of God and the love of fellow man and duty to your fellow man. And I have absolutely no doubt that those are beliefs and duties that we share. And so that is a reason why I think that it is such a privilege for me, thanks to Islamic Help, to be able to go in such terrible times and support people we have known.
Yeah.
I think one of the most distressing thing is the loss of life, which is really inconceivable. The loss of life and the life-changing injuries. Behind that comes the destruction of so many symbols of tradition, so many sites of historical and cultural significance.
Yeah.
Do you know, the thing that stands out for me is the destruction of the great Omari Mosque, which is one of the oldest in Islam. The Omari Mosque was once upon a time a Byzantine cathedral, and itself was said to have been built on the foundations of a Philistine temple.
Yeah.
So it's been a site of culture and faith over many centuries, and now once again has been destroyed. I think the destruction of buildings is of less importance than the deaths and injuries to people. But these wonderful places are a very important link with the past and should be preserved or rebuilt, and I don't understand the reason for their destruction.
Yeah, it's part of history, culture, like you mentioned, and everything, and it's a humanitarian situation. Like, you know, there's many churches that have been destroyed that we've seen, many Christian populations within Gaza, and I think that's always important to kind of recognize as well, that it is a humanitarian situation, and it is the case that, like you said, it's more important that the people survive, but the buildings, they mean something. The university, the mosques, the churches, the hospitals, all of those things, it's culture, it's part of identity. And
WHO lists, or many months ago when I last checked, listed 195 sites of cultural significance which had been destroyed, and that contributes hugely to the ghastliness of the conflict.
Yeah, definitely.
I think from a faith perspective as well, I know we've touched on it, regardless of what faith you believe in, situations like this, everyone just comes together. I mean, how welcoming, how would you describe the personality of the people in Gaza?
Well, for us, they've always been tremendously welcoming. I think part of that was due to the founder of our charity, who is a very warm and open person, and to watch him in action was an inspiration. But I think that when we first arrived, we were naturally treated in a guarded sort of way. You know, here's another group. Gaza is overwhelmed by foreign visitors who come and go. I think that because we've been going for such a long time, we have a terribly warm welcome, and that is heartwarming, but it makes the guilt of leaving far worse. And of course, we are still in touch with our friends and colleagues.
Yeah. So I think just moving on, in terms of the plans kind of moving forward and stuff, what are the plans for Ideals in terms of Gaza, like the next deployment? And
where we were is that our project was entering its fifth and we hoped final stage. Fundamentally, we had been involved in treatment, training, building capacity and delivering equipment in perhaps August, September last year, when we were entering our 5th phase, we had 3 objectives. We had the objective of supporting, sustaining and expanding the capacity that now existed in the Ministry of Health hospitals. The second objective was to, quite ambitious really, was to bring all 5 main Ministry of Health hospitals up to modern standards of trauma care.
Yeah.
And the third, ironically, was to assist in the planning for the next escalation.
Yeah.
Well, that beat us to it.
Yeah.
And no one could have anticipated the horror of this war. At the time of the Great March of Return in 2018, 2019, we were asked to plan, to assist in the planning for a conflict in which there were 60,000 casualties. Now, at that time, none of us could envisage a conflict with that number of dead and wounded, and yet it's happened. Now, we're told that the WHO figures are disputed, but we're closing in on 140,000 dead and wounded, 41,000 dead, 41,500 dead. At the latest estimate, 97,000 wounded, an unknown number buried under the rubble. The figures are apocalyptic. When you think of a population of, at the start, of 2.3 million, it's now estimated by WHO to be about 2.1 million. And if you think 140,000, for us in particular, for our project, WHO estimate there are between 22 and 25,000 people with life-changing limb injuries. Now, those are the people who will be the focus of our project going forward, if we can re-establish it, which is why we're so keen to be involved in any reconstruction planning after the war.
How can NGOs or the government support hospitals more in Gaza? What would you say, Dr. Groom?
Well, the tragic thing, of course, is to watch Shifa being totally destroyed, because that was the biggest hospital. And our colleagues who were working there at the time have given us very graphic description of what happened and how they were, how their function was removed and then many of the buildings destroyed. But even Shifa is beginning to function again. We're told that in the library there's now an emergency department developing. And what is extraordinary for me is how the hospitals in the south, Nasser and European Gaza, which have been closed, evacuated, sometimes perhaps attacked, how they are now working. It is quite extraordinary how they can reinvent themselves. Now, how can NGOs help? Well, NGOs can help at every stage. I think they can help in the material business of the buildings. They can certainly help with provision of equipment. They can help with training, both within Gaza and fellowships beyond Gaza. And of course, they can help in expanding the service, because one of the features of the casualties is how many amputees there are. Well, amputation is sometimes inevitable because it's gone, the limb is gone, but sometimes it's necessary to provide an effective locomotor organ. In other words, if you've got a useless foot, it's a useless, painful foot, it's better to have that removed and have a leg that you can use. But all of that depends on effective prosthetic provision. and the main rehabilitation hospital, the Hamad Hospital, has been destroyed. So at the moment there is no prosthetic provision.
Yeah.
And NGOs can certainly help in that provision. So I think there would be a role for NGOs from start to finish. What is absolutely necessary is some level of coordination, because we reached a point in March, April, when my second visit, when Rosie's first, was that there were too many NGOs in one hospital, and that we couldn't work adequately, we couldn't provide the care we wished to provide, and there was a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
So that organisation, synchronisation of the NGO effort would make an enormous difference to the benefit.
And I think obviously this podcast, one of the purposes of it is, I think first and foremost, obviously, working with Ideals, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I think when we set this up as well, we knew we were working with, one of the more established organisation that's, been to Gaza many times, is, the experience that you guys have and everything like that. So we're really, really proud to be working with Ideals, with yourself, Graeme, especially as well because everybody around Islamic Help loves you. When we did all of the dinners and everything like that, I remember everybody kind of really, really kind of happy to meet all of you, and especially yourself and everything like that as well. I think,
May I just interrupt briefly there and say that this feeling is entirely mutual, and it's mutual for several reasons. Perhaps first of all because we found you to be such an effective, approachable, warm and genuine organisation. But also because, and this is very important, for 14 years we have kept our heads down. We have kept quiet, we've got on with our work, and we've done that for fear of exclusion. What is happening now is such a monstrous evil that we believe it is time for us to bear witness to that. And we could not have found a better partner to join us in the matter of bearing witness. In other words, with Islamic Help, we have really been in a position to make clear the abominable things that are happening in Gaza, and we are very grateful to you for that.
I think that's where the partnership really works, in the sense that you guys are the experts on the ground. You're the medical experts. We don't have that, capacity on our side. We do programs work, we do some medical projects, but whenever we do medical projects, we are partnering with experts because medical work is very technical. You need the experts to be with it and stuff. And on our side, we can help with the fundraising aspect, with the getting the word out, the raising awareness, all of those kind of things. And I think as Ideals and Islamic Help, it's really worked well. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, we're going to have a lot of donors hopefully watching this, people that have donated towards the campaign. What would your message be to those people in terms of, obviously them supporting the campaign before, but also continuing to support that? What would you like to say to them?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say to them is a huge thank you for the support we've had in the past, because we could do absolutely nothing without support. When we started going to Gaza in 2009, we were a very small and amateurish organisation. We paid our own way, we paid our airfares, we paid our hotel bills, but our objective was education. And we could do that. We could not develop without external funding, and we could do nothing. We could have done absolutely nothing in this present context without the funding and support we've received from Islamic Help. So I would say the very first thing is an enormous thank you. The second thing is that we're not finished yet. There must be a ceasefire at some stage. We will then enter the reconstruction phase, And when we do that, we will need help until the job is done.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely, from our side as Islamic Help, and I know our community as well, our donors are amazing. They always, give, and I think there's always going to be that willingness, that commitment, that passion to whatever happens with Gaza now. I think it's going to be the case that, whatever it goes through, whether it's an emergency phase for the next few years and then rebuild, whenever that time comes, we're with the people of Gaza, and we're with, ideals to support as much as we can, inshallah.
100%. And I think I was just about to move on to our next segment, which is something called a Mythbuster. So what we tend to do is, we've heard about all the remarkable work and efforts, and honestly, you're so inspiring sitting here and sharing all these stories. But sadly, there are certain people in the charity sector that have certain comments, or they're just cautious about donating towards this project. So I think one of the popular tweets that came out was, if we were to support medical assistance, how do we know charities are able to get the funds to the places that are needed in hospitals in Gaza? What would you say or respond to that tweet?
Well, I'd say that to date it was very clear. The money we have raised in the past has gone to where it's needed, and the reason that we know that is that it goes with us. We buy equipment, and we have taken it with us.
Sure.
So that there's no diversion. Mm-hmm. It doesn't go to a store somewhere. We did have a rather tricky moment when the PA in Ramallah wanted us to channel all our aid, money and material, through Ramallah. And we were concerned that it might not all go where it had been pledged. So that was quite a difficult diplomatic moment, but it passed. And there has the equipment that we source outside Gaza, to date, all of it has gone where it was intended. Yeah. None of us, in terms of money, none of the volunteers are paid, so that the money goes only for our living expenses. We do not support Hamas in any direct way. Certainly no money goes towards it, and no money is taken from us. Of course we don't support them because it's against the law. Hamas is prescribed, and we obey the humanitarian law, and we take careful advice about how we can work in Gaza and stay within the law, and we're very, very careful about that. So I think if we're talking to donors who are worried that the donations may be diverted to buying weapons or digging tunnels or whatever it happens to be, to date that hasn't happened. I can say that with absolute confidence, and there is no reason why it should happen in the future.
And I think
it's really important to get that clarity, isn't it, Nazim?
Yeah,
even from,
definitely, of
from
course.
Our side.
And I think one of the things as well is, obviously, we had the dinners, we were doing them across the UK in terms of meeting our communities, showing them the work that we want to do, and feeding back to those who had already donated. And I think one of the things with this is that, and the feedback that we got from our community as well, was that they felt very confident in it, because they met Graeme, they met Andy, they met Dr. Basil, they met Victoria Rose and everything, the people that went with the aid into Gaza and gave it to the hospitals directly. And I don't think there was many kind of options that had that kind of transparency, that feedback, that all right, we're going to give money towards the medical equipment, we're going to give money towards sending out the surgeons, they're going to go into the hospitals, support them. This is how it's going to happen. This is, it was very kind of A to Z. And I think that really helped with gaining the support, because obviously I think it's natural for the community, for people to have their reservations, because Gaza is a difficult place to work in. If it wasn't, then anybody would be doing
social
it,
media, the news, and they are conscious and they're thinking, is the money getting there? So I think it is quite a good question for them to quite rightfully be asking. But I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Groom, it's good to have that clarity and that clarification.
Well, I've had that question put to me both directly and indirectly, and that's my response. That first of all, we're very cautious about how the money is used because of the prescription legislation, and we definitely don't want to fall foul of that. But that aside, we're very aware that people give money, they donate money for a specific project, and it's extremely important for us to know that it's not deflected for any other purpose. And from my perspective, I've never known it to be. No, I'm tempted to say not a single penny.
So we have another section of the podcast, another segment that we have. We do it for everybody. It's called My First Time and stuff. So what we usually do, we ask any of our guests about a first time, about something, and just get them to reflect on it. I think one thing I wanted to ask you about is, I guess the kind of state of the podcast is your first time in Gaza. What was that like? What was the experience like? What was it like going in? How did you feel?
Well, the first time in Gaza is an awfully long time ago now. It's in 2009.
Yeah.
So that it's memories are hazy. But we went to do a particular project. We went to run a course in primary trauma care. Primary trauma care is an algorithm supported by World Health Organization for the immediate treatment of injured patients. And it has many equivalents that are common throughout the Western world, but they are franchise courses, and anyone doing them in the Western world has to pay a franchise fee to the, and of course that's inappropriate for many, perhaps most economies. So our first role was to introduce primary trauma care to Gaza, as Ideals before me had done in Pakistan and in India and in other places. So, and that was a teaching course. We went for a week. We did two-day courses for providers. And then from those providers, we selected people and did an instructor's course. So my first experience of Gaza was shortly after the 2008-2009 conflict. We saw the destruction, but it was on a completely different scale to what there is now. The population was stable and welcoming. The medical system was established, but because of isolation, required development, if you like, and we were hoping to be one small brick in building a new concept of trauma care. So my very first trip was a bit, oh gosh, we're here in Gaza, and then arriving at the crossing, and ahead of us were two youngsters who had their bags searched, and in their bags were two bottles of alcohol. And the Hamas guards at the border took their bottles and spoke to them, and then they took them over to a pit. Oh, what are we going to see now? And then they just poured the alcohol into the pit and threw the bottles in after them. And that was a moment. But our founder, the Ideals founder, was always one for taking direct action, and although he couldn't speak Arabic, he engaged the Hamas guards in conversation, and in a moment, everyone was laughing and joking.
Okay.
And because he was that sort of person.
Yeah. So a very tense situation became very
Yes,
nice.
And in next to no time, he had them laughing and joking. And that was really my memory. We had a very interesting educational project in which we met probably 40 or 50 medical people in these 3 courses over 1 week. And then the system, primary trauma care, sort of took off and is still one of the most important courses now run by Palestinians and the Ministry of Health. One of the most important training programs for all, what we'd call it, first attenders.
I guess that's what you would consider like a bit of a legacy, that you were able to set that up and is continuing to do.
Not a personal legacy, but a charity legacy. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. It's something really to be proud of, and you know.
Well, that was the beginning.
Fantastic. So, look, I feel like as if we can sit here all day speaking to Dr. Groom and learning about his experiences. It's fantastic. So, we're going to move to our final segment of the day. I'm just going to ask our wonderful producer to put a quote of the day. We're not going to mention where this quote's come from. And I just want to gather your thoughts, Dr. Groom, on this wonderful quote as it comes up. So, it says... oh gosh, it's like an eye test, isn't it? So it's like, no matter what happens in life, be good to people. Being good to people is a wonderful legacy to leave behind. So we just spoke about legacy.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that quote?
Well, I think that, you know, I agree with that sentiment. I think that it doesn't really matter what you do at an organisational level. The important thing is personal contact. I think if you can connect with people at a personal level, then that amplifies whatever else you might do. And I would completely support that, even though it comes from Taylor Swift, who is absolutely not my generation. In fact, Rosie would say...
Oh, was that a Taylor Swift quote?
That was a Taylor Swift quote.
Oh, okay, fair enough. It's an interesting place to get the...
Rosie would say that travelling with ideals in Gaza is a bit like travelling with Taylor Swift because everyone knows us.
Yeah.
That's what she would say repeatedly. Not true, of course, but I think that the sentiment behind that is just connect on a human level. And what we would say, the Christian view of that would do unto others as you would they did unto you. And that's what we try to do.
We definitely prefer you over Taylor Swift here with us today. I really appreciate it as well.
You've definitely connected with us, and I'm sure many hearts that are watching and viewing this podcast have felt even more connected after this podcast. So just want to wrap up and say a massive thank you for being here with us today. You've shared some amazing stories, some stories that are very difficult to even listen to, but it's been an absolute honour, and we pray that our partnership and collaboration can continue, and
definitely just want to say thank you, just personally, because obviously this partnership, we brought it together, and working with yourselves, working with Ideals, working with Tina, who's going to be on the next podcast as well, and Andy and everybody. It's been an absolute honor working with you, and to know you guys, to know what you guys do, and you know the risk that you take when you all go out there and everything. These are things that I could never imagine doing myself, and it's just an inspiration and a blessing to work with you.
Well, I think from our perspective, the feeling is absolutely mutual, because I would just reinforce, from a personal point of view, it is much worse for our families than it is for us. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that working with Islamic Help has been an absolute joy, because we're now at the phase of bearing witness, and without Islamic Help, we could not bear witness. So I have an equal thank you for you for letting us bear witness, and to Islamic Help supporters for enabling us, for supporting us and allowing us to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, there you have it, guys. An amazing first podcast with Dr. Graeme Groom, as well as Dr. Victoria Rose, who left us earlier. We're hoping to showcase some more superheroes in our next episode. So thank you for tuning in. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum.